Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure just to welcome you here this evening. I'm Merit Jano, Dean of SEPA, and it's really a pleasure to open this evening's event where we have a wonderful lecture by Professor Andrew Bacevich, who will be introduced, and a discussion that will be moderated by our own Professor Richard Betts, who is also director of the Saltzman Institute. And as many of you know, this is really the inaugural public lecture of the George McGovern Lecture with Professor Bacevich. And I hope everyone here knows who George McGovern was. If not, please leave immediately. He was a great American historian, author, representative, Democratic presidential nominee, really, I think you could say an icon of American liberalism. He was known for his anti-war stance during the Vietnam War and a very progressive agenda supporting civil rights, anti-poverty programs, strongly denouncing the Vietnam War. He really helped define a certain vision of America in the world. And I think we're very honored to have the George McGovern Professorship here. It was created in 2013 by an anonymous donor to recognize George McGovern's legacy. And we are really very privileged tonight to have our provost, John Coatsworth, with us here today. He's not only a leading scholar of Latin America, economic and international history, but of course served as dean of SEPA before being named provost in 2012. I think that it's a great pleasure for me to welcome him back here. I think he has helped to design this very special professorship, and thank you very much, John, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Merit. It's a pleasure to be back at SEPA. As you know, as the provost of the university, I'm the chief academic officer, and I can tell you in all honesty that this is the only part of the university I don't worry about all the time. I also want to say a word of thanks to SEPA, to Dean Jano, and to the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies for co-hosting the event this evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We are actually celebrating two events this evening. The first is the creation of the George Stanley McGovern Fund at the university. This fund was created by an anonymous donor to make it possible to bring to the university the kinds of visiting fellows and professors who might not quite fit the traditional academic mold. Unusually creative and critical thinkers, academics, activists, former or soon-to-be former policymakers, public intellectuals, people whose presence would enrich the intellectual life of the university. Second, we are celebrating the appointment of the first McGovern visiting professor, Andrew Bacevich, who manages to fit that description perfectly, and in ways that link him to the McGovern legacy of devotion to peace and social progress. George McGovern, like Andrew Bacevich, was born and raised in the great American Middle West, McGovern in rural South Dakota, Bacevich in Illinois and Indiana. Both served with distinction in the United States Army. McGovern as a decorated bomber pilot in World War II, Bacevich, who graduated from West Point a generation later in Vietnam and elsewhere in a military career that spanned 23 years. Both men were drawn to the study of history, the history of their country, and spent years of their lives as history teachers, teaching history to college students. McGovern received his PhD in U.S. history from Northwestern University in 1953. His dissertation examined the Great Colorado Coal Strike of 1913-14. Mr. Bacevich earned his PhD in U.S. diplomatic history from Princeton in 1992 for a dissertation on the diplomatic career of Army Major General Frank Ross McCoy, who undertook a series of diplomatic missions for successive U.S. administrations early in the 20th century, culminating in his appointment by Secretary of State Henry Stimson to represent the United States on an international commission that investigated and condemned the 1931 Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Finally, both men are prolific, or were prolific writers. McGovern wrote or edited or compiled 14 books. Bacevich, so far, 7. And both McGovern and Bacevich, McGovern toward the end of his life, published books condemning the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. We could also point to differences between the two men. Bacevich has never run for public office and has at times described himself as a Catholic conservative. McGovern spent a good part of his life as the liberal candidate for every office he sought. Despite this apparent ideological discrepancy, the careful reader will discover in the writings of both men a profound commitment to peace and social progress, and a compelling critique of the militarism that came to be so deeply embedded in the policy and political culture of the United States in the second half of the 20th century and beyond. Andrew Bacevich will speak tonight on the subject of his next book, number 8 already, I think. 10 Theses, Lessons from America's War for the Greater Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Columbia University's first George S. McGovern visiting professor.
Well, I'm grateful for the kind introduction and the wonderful turnout, and frankly for the terrific welcome that I have received in this community, at this university, and in this school. I got one problem tonight, and the problem is that I got about a 45-minute talk, and I think I've been told to talk for 25 minutes. So let me jump into this thing as quickly as I can with just one brief prefatory remark. I was flying home last Friday from an out-of-town speaking engagement. You know how you do. You're sitting on the plane, you work through your emails, and I discovered that somebody had sent me a new essay from the next issue of Foreign Affairs, and I opened it up, and it was called Pick Your Battles, written by Professor Betts of Columbia University. So I immediately read this essay, and as I did, I noted that it contained a number of themes that, in fact, are going to be featured in my talk this evening, and I thought to myself, ha! They'll think I'm as smart as Dick Betts. And then I thought, no, they're going to think I plagiarized Dick Betts. So let me begin with just 2 assurances. The first is that I know I'm not as smart as Dick Betts. And the second is, no, I didn't steal his work. I actually wrote this before I read the essay. So for better or worse, what you're going to hear is mine. For well over 30 years now, the United States military has been intensively engaged in various quarters of the Islamic world, and there is obviously no end to that involvement anywhere in sight. Tick off the countries in that region that U.S. forces in recent decades have invaded, occupied, garrisoned, bombed, or raided, and where American soldiers have killed or been killed. Since 1980, they include, by my count, Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but also Iran, Lebanon, Libya, Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, and of course now Syria. The list just keeps getting longer. To judge by the various official explanations coming out of Washington, the mission of the troops dispatched to these various quarters has been to defend or deter or liberate, punishing the wicked and protecting the innocent while spreading liberal values and generally keeping Americans safe. What are we to make of the larger enterprise in which the United States has been engaged for well over 3 decades now? What is the nature of the military struggle that we are waging? What should we call it? For several years after 9/11, Americans referred to it as the global war on terrorism, a deeply misleading term that has since fallen out of favor. For a brief period during the early years of the George W. Bush administration, certain neoconservatives promoted the term World War IV. This never caught on, however, in part because, unlike other major 20th century conflicts, it found the American people sitting on the sidelines. With interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan dragging on inconclusively, some military officers in the middle of the last decade began referring to what they called the Long War, while nicely capturing the temporal dimension of the conflict. This label had nothing to say about purpose, adversary, or location. So as with World War IV, the Long War never really gained much traction. Here's another possibility. Since 1980, back when President Jimmy Carter promulgated the Carter Doctrine, the United States has been engaged in what we should rightfully call America's war for the greater Middle East. The premise underlying this war can be simply stated. With disorder, dysfunction, and disarray in the Islamic world posing a growing threat to vital U.S. national security interests, the adroit application of hard power will enable the United States to check those tendencies and thereby preserve the American way of life. That's the expectation. Choose whatever term you like. Police, pacify, shape, control, dominate, transform. In 1980, President Carter launched the United States on a project aimed at nothing less than determining the fate and future of the peoples inhabiting the Ark of Nations from the Maghreb and the Arabian Peninsula to the Persian Gulf and Central Asia. Since World War II, American soldiers had fought and died in Asia. Even when the wars in Korea and Vietnam ended, U.S. troop contingents continued to garrison that region. In Europe, a major U.S. military presence dating from the start of the Cold War signaled Washington's willingness to fight there as well. But prior to Carter's watershed 1980 statement, no comparable U.S. commitment toward the Islamic world existed. And now that was beginning to change. Only in retrospect does this become clear, of course. At the time when President Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital national security interest, that's the literal meaning of the Carter Doctrine, he did not intend to embark upon a war. Nor did he anticipate the course that the war was going to follow, its duration, costs, consequences. Like the European statesman who 100 years ago touched off the cataclysm we know today as World War I, Carter merely lit a fuse without knowing where it led. Partly for domestic political reasons, remember that 1980 was a presidential election year, partly to counter perceptions that America itself was flagging. Remember that the Iran hostage crisis was a continuing embarrassment. Carter wanted to make a show of drawing a line in the sand. And along with plenty of oil, the Persian Gulf region had plenty of sand. Here, it seemed, prompted by the successive surprises of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, here was the place to draw that line. Neither Carter nor his advisors foresaw what awaited 10 or 20 years down the line. They were largely clueless as to what lay inside the Pandora's box that they insisted on opening. But what they and their successors in government found there prompted them to initiate a sequence of military actions, some large, some small, that deserved collective recognition as a war. And of course, that war continues down to the present day. Look closely enough and the dots connect. Much as, say, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the invasion of Grenada, among many other events, all constitute episodes in what we call the Cold War. So too, seemingly disparate events such as the Beirut bombing of 1983, the Black Hawk Down debacle of 1993, and the Iraq invasion of 2003, among many others, all form part of a single narrative. In acknowledging the existence of that narrative, seeing America's war for the greater Middle East whole is a prerequisite to learning. Let me state plainly my own overall assessment of that war. We have not won it. we are not winning it, and simply pressing on is unlikely to produce more positive results next year or the year after, and hence the imperative of absorbing the lessons this ongoing war has to teach. Learning offers a first step towards devising wiser, more effective, and less costly policies. So the 10 theses that follow constitute my preliminary effort to identify the most important of those lessons. When I first started working on this, I just finished reading a new biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's one of my heroes, and of course he was a Lutheran, I'm a Catholic, and Lutherans are always banging theses up on doors, so I came up with this thesis. First thesis, center of gravity. Devised by the German philosopher, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of get as far as I can in this, and then watch somebody wave at me and say, stop talking, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Okay? Center of gravity. Devised by the German philosopher Clausewitz, the phrase center of gravity refers to that factor upon which a war's outcome ultimately turns. Center of gravity could be the enemy army or capital. It could refer to some critical resource or a piece of valuable terrain. Correctly identifying the center of gravity doesn't guarantee victory, but at least you have an inkling of how a war might be won or whether it even can be won. Now, the war for the Greater Middle East began in the desert when President Carter's failed 1980 attempt to free, with his failed 1980 attempt to free the hostages held in Iran. And since then, the war has featured campaigns in other remote and desolate places. That said, Americans ought to have learned by now that in their war for the Greater Middle East, the key terrain is urban. In this contest, outcomes turn on what people think and believe. What matters most is not killing adversaries. U.S. forces know how to do that. But influencing populations. People constitute this war's center of gravity. And here it must be said the United States labors under massive disadvantages. When American soldiers venture into this key terrain, they do so as alien intruders. They arrive in cities like Baghdad and Kabul as heirs of a Western civilization that has seldom acted to further the well-being of Muslims. That is to say, U.S. efforts are unavoidably tainted by the prior actions of Europeans who, in attempting to incorporate the Middle East into their own empires, made such a hash of things. Like it or not, we are the successors to those imperialists. The whole notion of the West may be an artificial construct that today has long since outlived its usefulness. But having for decades declared that we are part of that West, we cannot suddenly divorce ourselves from its deservedly unsavory reputation across much of the Islamic world. Washington's insistence that U.S. intentions today differ from and are more benign than those of, say, Great Britain a century ago only invites ridicule and incredulity. This is especially the case when we stride into Iraq or Afghanistan arm in arm with our British cousins. To our ears, the phrase Anglo-American conjures up glorious memories of a partnership forged to free a continent gripped by slavery. Back in June 1944, General Eisenhower summoned the Anglo-American forces under his command to embark upon what he unabashedly referred to as a great crusade. When President George W. Bush, in an unscripted moment, referred to the Iraq War as a crusade, he was alluding to those memories. Well, residents of the Islamic world will inevitably assess Anglo-American purposes somewhat differently. Furthermore, their own collective memory includes repeated encounters with crusades. And those that their forebears experienced that remain part of their shared consciousness drew their inspiration not from a desire to liberate, but from a determination to conquer. Second thesis, the role of technology. As the Cold War was winding down and as the war for the greater Middle East was heating up, leading members of the U.S. national security elite persuaded themselves that technology was transforming the very nature of war. Fast computers and precision-guided munitions promised to enhance by orders of magnitude the efficacy of force. And since technological superiority is ostensibly the American strong suit, then this high-tech approach to warfare promised to endow U.S. forces with a decisive edge against any and all adversaries. Well, the United States has now fully tested this proposition, trying various approaches in various places, and except in the narrowest tactical terms, it has proven to be utterly false. As a means to pacify or control or liberate or transform, and over the past 3 decades we've tried to do all these things, the preferred American style of warfare possesses limited utility when applied to the greater Middle East. I think the ongoing campaign against ISIS offers only the most recent illustration of this point. Precision air strikes can destroy specific targets, for example, in this case, the American equipment that they captured. But the Pentagon, as the Pentagon itself candidly acknowledges, air power alone will not accomplish the announced mission of defeating and destroying this latest enemy. That will require boots on the ground. Yet boots are hard to come by. Apart from a handful of militant politicians and pundits, almost uniformly too old for military service, few Americans have much stomach for undertaking another large-scale ground campaign in this region. The disappointments of our last Iraq war are still too fresh. And as for would-be allies, some are reluctant to dive in, and others possess little by way of useful capabilities. So we are left with this strange circumstance of the world's most powerful military doggedly doing what it does best, even if what it does possesses only modest relevance to the problem at hand. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld once touched off a minor furor, remarking that you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want. 30-some years into the war for the greater Middle East, the Army, or more broadly, the U.S. military establishment that we have, has not adapted itself to what fighting that war entails. Each of the services remains deeply invested in a model and an identity that might be appropriate to some war, but not to the one we find ourselves fighting. Third thesis, strategy. In present-day Washington strategy, that is to say, the principled application of power to achieve objectives of first-order importance, has become a lost art. Seems to me that any strategy worthy of the name sees around the curve. It expands the range of plausible and affordable options. In short, it creates choices. What passes for U.S. strategy in the greater Middle East has been almost entirely reactive. Rather than principled, it has been opportunistic. And it has repeatedly failed to anticipate second-order consequences. Instead of creating choice, it has fostered a sense that the United States has no alternative but to press on, vaguely hoping that persistence will produce a better result. Again, the campaign against ISIS illustrates the point. Now, sometimes in war, doggedness can be a virtue, but sometimes it's a sign of stupidity. And in this case, I submit the latter applies. Where is the debate over basic strategic alternatives in academic circles? It may exist, as the writings of Professor Betts or Posen, who's coming in 2 days, right? Or Walt or Mearsheimer might suggest. But in Washington, there is no such debate over strategic alternatives, which I would submit is a rather astonishing fact, given the paltry returns achieved over the course of 3+ decades of military effort. One would think that there would be a lively discussion of, is there another way to deal with this problem? During the Cold War, the United States made many costly mistakes. That said, the concept of containment did provide at least a basic framework for sound strategy. 30-some years after it began, we cannot make the same statement about America's war for the greater Middle East. In lieu of strategy, we have platitudes. Yet, I would submit that feasible alternatives may, in fact, exist. For example, what supposedly endows the Persian Gulf with such huge importance is the concentration of the world's oil reserves in that region. Ensuring access to that oil is what prompted the United States to embark upon its war for the greater Middle East in the first place. But what if, as appears to be the case, what if the United States stands on the brink of something approximating energy self-sufficiency, if not the United States, North America? Should that not affect the reigning perception that the American way of life is somehow tied to the fate of Saudi Arabia and its oil-rich neighbors? Shouldn't that change in our energy environment create options, choices? Well, it should. But thus far, policymakers seem to be oblivious to that possibility. Fourth thesis, the national security apparatus. I refer here to that sprawling network of institutions that emerged in the aftermath of World War II and has since grown like Topsy. Today, that network centers on the Department of Defense, of course, but it also includes the so-called intelligence community, select congressional committees, think tanks, advocacy groups, lobbies, defense contractors, certain academic programs, and even specialized publications, all of them devoted to the proposition that national security must remain priority number one. But when it comes to fresh ideas, this vast realm has become a dead zone. And even when it comes to implementing stale ideas, it's notoriously slow and inefficient. To say that the national security apparatus exists chiefly to perpetuate itself may be slightly unfair, but only slightly. In his recent memoir, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates complains about the unresponsiveness of the national security bureaucracy even when called upon to meet wartime needs. In his time, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld made the same point. Here's Rumsfeld. This is a great quote. Speaking on, note the date please, September 10th, 2001. Quote, "The topic today," he's talking to Pentagon employees, "the topic today," says Rumsfeld, "is an adversary that poses a threat, a serious threat, to the security of the United States of America. This adversary," he goes on, "is one of the world's last bastions of central planning. It governs by dictating 5-year plans with brutal consistency. It stifles free thought and crushes new ideas. It disrupts the this is the Secretary of Defense. It disrupts the defense of the United States and places the lives of men and women in uniform at risk. Perhaps," he continues, "this adversary sounds like the former Soviet Union. But that enemy is gone. Our foes are more subtle and implacable today. You may think I'm describing one of the last decrepit dictators of the world, but this adversary's closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy." Well, wildly wrong and misguided in so many ways, on this last point at least, Rumsfeld was right. Nothing that has occurred since, in the years since, reduces the salience of his critique. Granted, things look different to those who labor inside the bowels of that apparatus. Their efforts to streamline and reinvent and become efficient are always underway. Not long ago, for example, Secretary of Defense Hagel announced plans to reduce the size of his own staff. At present, I'm not sure how many people work for the dean here, but at present, the office of the Secretary of Defense has 2,400 employees. Some office. Hagel's senior staff currently consists of a deputy secretary, an executive secretary, 5 undersecretaries, 6 deputy undersecretaries, 15 assistant secretaries, and 5 principal deputy assistant secretaries. Not to worry, Hagel has announced plans to reduce OSD staffing by 200 spaces, from 2,400 to 2,200. Oh, and he's given his people until 2019 to figure out how to do that. You're not going to want to hold your breath. Fifth, generalship. Now, in any war, large or small, superior generalship alone does not guarantee a successful outcome. If it did, Richmond, Virginia might today be the capital of an independent nation. Yet competent generals increase the odds of coming out on top, while inept ones can all but single-handedly turn a winning hand into a losing one. At their worst, bumbling senior military officers can actually aid and abet the enemy. Now, the American Civil War lasted as long as it did for many reasons. But prominent among those reasons was a quality of leadership under which the Army of the Potomac suffered when commanded by the likes of Irvin McDowell, George McClellan, John Pope, Ambrose Burnside, and Fighting Joe Hooker. And I would submit that we should not assume that present-day U.S. military leadership is all that much better. A recently retired three-star general is about to come out with a book called Why We Lost. It's his account, this three-star general, it's his account of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And we lost, he argues, with an honesty rarely seen in military circles. We lost in large part due to the inadequacies of the senior officers charged with waging these wars. And that's an argument that deserves serious consideration. Taken as a whole, the performance of senior U.S. officers during the decades of America's war for the Greater Middle East has been decidedly mixed. And this is true even with regard to that elite group of top commanders, sometimes referred to, apparently with people that have a straight face, sometimes referred to as savior generals. Operation Desert Storm's H. Norman Schwarzkopf, along with more recent worthies such as Tommy Franks, David Petraeus, and Stanley McChrystal, were all once mentioned in the same breath with George Patton. With the passage of time, however, the achievements that earned them wide renown have lost their luster. Today, Desert Storm seems less like a historic victory than an opening act in a chapter of U.S. military history that most Americans would prefer to forget. And that is at least in part due to flawed decisions directly attributable to General Schwarzkopf. No one thinks of Tommy Franks as the liberator of Baghdad, as they once did briefly a decade ago. As for Petraeus's famous surge in Iraq and the Afghan equivalent engineered by McChrystal, whatever they once appeared to achieve has long since become unstuck. Whatever John McCain might persist in claiming, the United States did not win the Iraq War. It merely bequeathed to the people of Iraq a war that the United States fecklessly began and then failed to finish. And a similar outcome is likely in Afghanistan. We will leave. The war there will continue. And as demonstrations of superior generalship, I think General Patton would be decidedly unimpressed. In expeditions undertaken in at least a dozen countries, senior U.S. military commanders have conclusively achieved U.S. political objectives. It's a workable definition of victory. On no more than two occasions. After the first of those, you mentioned this in your article, the Kosovo War of 1999, as soon as the shooting stopped, President Bill Clinton sacked the general in charge for errors of judgment. And the second occasion, the May 2011 operation that killed bin Laden, was hardly larger in scope than a police raid. The armed services of the United States know how to grow first-rate sergeants and captains. Their apparent inability to do the same when it comes to identifying, developing, and selecting officers for the very top jobs is at a minimum troubling. Sixth thesis, the U.S. military system. This is my favorite hobby horse. The intensification of the war for the Greater Middle East after 9/11 revealed hitherto unsuspected defects in America's basic approach to raising its military forces. Notwithstanding the considerable virtues of our professional military, notably durability and fighting prowess at the tactical level, the existing military system has to rate as a failure. You have all volunteer forces like a burger from a fast food joint. It's cheap, filling, and tastes good going down. You sort of say, well, what's not to like? But you take a closer look, and problems, not to mention hidden costs, become apparent. Here are the problems with the existing U.S. military system. It encourages political irresponsibility. It underwrites an insipid conception of citizenship. It's undemocratic. It turns out to be exorbitantly expensive. And it doesn't win. Dishonesty pervades the relationship between the U.S. military and society. Rhetorically, we support the troops, but the support is seldom more than skin deep. In practice, we, the people, subject our troops, the troops that we profess to care about, to serial abuse. As authorities in Washington commit U.S. forces to wars that are unnecessary or ill-managed or unwinnable, Americans manifest something close to indifference. The bungled rollout of a health care reform program might generate public attention and even outrage. By comparison, a bungled military campaign elicits shrugs. Certainly, our reliance on professional soldiers has relieved the rest of us of any responsibility to contribute to the nation's defense. But is that actually such a good thing? Back in the 1970s, when Vietnam induced Americans to abandon the tradition of the citizen soldier, President Richard Nixon responded by creating a standing army. That's at least what the founders of this republic would have called the all-volunteer force. And in their day, standing army was a term of opprobrium. An army consisting of professionals rather than citizens, the founders believed, was at odds with the principles animating the American Revolution and infused in documents such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Well, the shadow of Vietnam lingers even now, but with ironic implications. Americans today seem intent on making amends for sins committed or said to have been committed back then, when supporting the troops had become optional, and when overtly pro-military attitudes defined the very inverse of hip, like men who got crew cuts, or women who wore bras, or anyone who voted for Nixon. Today, blaming the troops for the wars they are sent to fight has become all but unthinkable. Thank you for your service trips off American lips as easily as have a nice day, and with as little real meaning. Bonhoeffer had a phrase for such posturing. He called it cheap grace. And the actual existing relationship between the American soldiers and the American people is shot full of cheap grace. Seventh thesis, the political economy of war. When do you want me to quit talking? Keep going. The second-order consequences of relying on professional soldiers are likewise unfortunate. Washington's appetite for waging war in the Greater Middle East has exceeded the willingness of young Americans to volunteer for military service. This has created a gap. Too much war, too few warriors. This gap then has created an opening for so-called private security firms to flood the war zone. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, contractors ultimately outnumbered uniformed military personnel, taking on tasks traditionally performed by soldiers. And the results have fallen well short of being satisfactory. Last week's conviction of several former employees of the notorious Blackwater firm, who had murdered Iraqi civilians in cold blood, provide one indicator of the problem of relying on entities like this. But the issue goes beyond misconduct. Waste and corruption have occurred on a truly colossal scale. So much so that the Pentagon quite literally is unable to say where all the money has gone. Now, I'll admit, war has always created opportunities for some people to make money. But America's war for the greater Middle East today, in some respects, has become primarily a means to make money. Eighth thesis, history. Americans tend to remember what they find convenient or comforting, too often overlooking what actually matters. When it comes to seeing the world today, our perspective is still largely shaped by selective memories of World War II, its origins, conduct, and aftermath. Isolationism, even today, remains the great, even if largely fictive, boogeyman. Winston Churchill remains the ideal of the heroic leader. The post-war occupations of Germany and Japan remain the most instructive illustrations of what American leadership can be counted on to achieve. Yet the triumphal story of World War II, as a victory masterminded by the United States, is almost entirely irrelevant to the greater Middle East. The story that matters, the account of how the modern Middle East came into existence, is largely unknown to the general public. You know that story, but the general public doesn't. And what the public knows is often misleading, the result of entertaining but largely fanciful movies like Exodus. For the history that matters, we might pay marginally less attention to the Munich Conference of 1938, warning of the dangers of appeasing evil. Instead, we should pay somewhat more attention to the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which carved up the Ottoman Empire to suit British and French imperial interests and thereby yielded evil results that linger even today. Similarly, while paying homage to the Churchill who got Hitler right, we should pay homage to the Churchill who got Hitler right. We might ask ourselves, what possessed that same Churchill who got the Middle East so grotesquely wrong? In waging the war for the greater Middle East, our mental frame of reference remains stuck in the 20th century. And that frame is obsolete, like thinking about communications in terms of tubes and wires and postage stamps. The 21st century demands an entirely different historical perspective. Ninth thesis, regional allies. Some number of you are going to get mad at me, so just brace yourself. The longer America's war for the greater Middle East drags on, the more apparent it becomes that Washington has done a really lousy job of picking allies. Consider Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, for example. The United States seeks to reduce the prevalence of violent Islamic radicalism. The governments of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia actively promote it. They underwrite the jihadism that Washington is trying to suppress, and it's time to stop pretending otherwise. Then there is Israel. In important ways, U.S. interests and those of the Jewish state have long since diverged, even if it remains politically incorrect to say so out loud. To ensure the security and well-being of its citizens, the government of Israel vigorously employs its military muscle to preempt perceived threats and to ensure Israeli control of vital terrain and resources now and in perpetuity. In practical terms, that implies double standards when it comes to, say, possessing weapons of mass destruction. It also means skepticism regarding any so-called peace agreement, except on terms manifestly favorable to Israel. And from an Israeli perspective, let me emphasize, that makes very considerable sense. Yet to satisfy Israel's prerequisites for peace, nearby Arab states are going to have to become little Canadas, not only friendly, but also demilitarized, economically accessible, and with open and undefended borders. And this just seems kind of unlikely. Through action and inaction, Washington serves as Israel's willing enabler. By providing arms and technology, the United States guarantees Israel's qualitative edge, which is a euphemism for unchallengeable regional military supremacy. The United States also provides Israel with diplomatic cover, for example, tacitly accepting manifestly illegal Israeli actions such as settlement expansion on the West Bank. With what consequences? Well, by becoming party to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Israel's side, we create unwanted complications for the United States. And in doing so, we also exacerbate that previously mentioned tendency to overstate the importance of the Greater Middle East in what should be the hierarchy of U.S. strategic interests. The chief U.S. interest in this region lies in promoting, or I guess I should say restoring, stability. Anything else lies in the category of nice to have. And in that regard, the United States has long had a profound interest in responding comprehensively to the grievances of the Palestinian people. Yet the government of Israel, for its own good reasons, from its own perspective, the government of Israel will respond to the grievances of the Palestinian people in due time and only on Israeli terms. In the meantime, the persistence of those grievances has provided either a genuine cause of or a pretext for anti-American and anti-Western attitudes across much of the Islamic world. So when it comes to the war for the Greater Middle East, Israel belongs in the same category as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. As allies, all three are unhelpful. 10th and final thesis, religion. No single explanation exists for why the war for the Greater Middle East began and for why it persists, but religion figures as a central element. Secularized American elites either cannot grasp this or are unwilling to accept it. So they contrive alternative explanations such as terrorism. Yet rather than facilitating understanding, such explanations impede it. When it comes to religion and politics, Americans are tone deaf, incorrigibly ignorant, or simply naive. Religion is not supposed to matter in politics. Didn't the Enlightenment settle that once and for all? Well, no, it didn't. So our leaders can proclaim their high regard for Islam until they are blue in the face. They can insist over and over again that we are not at war with Islam, and their claims will fall on deaf ears throughout much of the Greater Middle East. Whatever Washington's intentions, we are engaged in what is, in effect, a religious war. That is, the ongoing war possesses an ineradicable religious dimension. That's the way a few 100 million Muslims see it, and their seeing it in those terms makes it so. The beginning of wisdom is not in denying that the war is, in some respects, about religion, but in acknowledging that war cannot provide an antidote to the fix that we have foolishly gotten ourselves into. Does the Islamic world pose something of a problem for the United States? You bet, in all sorts of ways. But after more than 3 decades of trying, it's pretty clear that the application of military power is unlikely to persuade the peoples of the Greater Middle East to share our views of God, freedom, family, identity, and the purpose of life. So the solution to the problems we face, if there is one, will be found in looking beyond the military realm. And this just might be the very biggest lesson that our experience with the war for the Greater Middle East ought to teach. Thank you very much.
As you spoke about our allies.
We have a microphone here. Thank you.
As you spoke about our allies in terms of states that we are allied with, and I think your points were very well taken. So it seems to me that the allies who have perhaps made the biggest difference in many of the arenas of this long war are the internal allies that we select in the states we go to, whether they are dictators or generals or sheikhs or whatever. And I wonder whether this is another area in which we have fallen short.
Well, yes. I mean, presidents have, with some regularity, and their deputies with some regularity, have proclaimed our support for democracy and our unwillingness, well, I'll leave it at that, our support for democracy, but whenever democracy has reared its ugly head, we have tended to not be particularly supportive. You can cite the case of Egypt, of course. I think you can cite the case of Algeria earlier, or in the decade of the 1990s. You can certainly cite the case of the Palestinians when they held what most people, I think, would view as their first sort of kind of honest election, and Hamas won, and we refused to recognize that outcome. My own sense, because my view is that we possess very little ability actually to shape the course of events in this region, particularly through the use of American military power. My view is that we should demilitarize our policy, play a very long game, a long game based on the assumption that the people of the Islamic world are going to have to sort out their futures for themselves. And one aspect of that long game should be to honestly, rather than dishonestly, support democracy when it appears, meaning even if you don't like the people who win, they won, and they deserve the opportunity to make their own mistakes. Is that a decent answer?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments today. My question is building off what okay, my question is really building off of what you were just talking about. I was just hoping you could speak a little bit about the democratic and other kinds of uprisings that have been going on in the region and the U.S. position towards it. In particular, if you could talk about Syria, and I'd be curious about your views as to sort of the U.S. decision as to how involved they should get towards that uprising in the early time before it really unfolded into this massive civil war, sort of the U.S. position towards the Assad regime, towards that uprising in comparison to the other uprisings that happened in the region. Thank you.
Well, I mean, we've made a considerable number of errors. I think you were asking, should we, early in the crisis, have taken forceful and decisive military action against the Assad regime in favor of the forces trying to overthrow Assad? I think I would have been reluctant to do so, at least without having a heck of a lot more intelligence than I have, somebody who doesn't have a security clearance, because I'm not sure how we would have identified the good guys, and how we would have been able to judge whether or not the good guys, even if they existed, could have had the military capacity to overthrow this regime. We didn't act. We made threats that we didn't follow through on. That was not wise. At this stage of the game, my view would be that the obligation of the United States, if we wish to acknowledge an obligation, should be one that focuses on alleviating the suffering of the people who have been dispossessed by this ongoing civil war. So I'd like to see not so much conversation about who or what we should be bombing in Syria and how much we should be willing to invest in that military effort, but what can we do to the couple of million people who are living in squalid refugee camps? to what degree are we willing to make available our wealth to alleviate the conditions of those people, I think we'd have a better chance to make a difference by following that path than by reverting to the standard notion that somehow American armed might is going to produce a positive outcome. Because over and over and over again, it doesn't.
Over here.
Thank you. Not in this set of talks and theses, you address in your other work regarding standing army and conscription and volunteer force. Why do we even need, as a former military officer myself, I thought that it was great to have a volunteer force. Then I came to realize, no, you're just making it a more efficient fighting force and the unintended consequences of that. But why do we even need a standing army at all? And projecting American interests abroad, why can't we just have a National Guard and border security? And then also, you mentioned in other works as far as national service. Why even have that? Why is that necessary for the U.S.?
Well, I probably can't persuade you that it is, but it's sort of, I think it depends to some degree on one's view of the world. I believe that to a very considerable degree the world is inherently a violent place, and that therefore we will continue to need formidable military forces. The question becomes, how should those forces be employed? You made reference to, why do we need to have forces to project power? I think that's a real good question. Or maybe I'd rephrase it a little bit. What does the projection of U.S. military power accomplish? At what cost? Now, wait a second, before you nod your head. I'd make an argument that the projection of American military power in Europe in the immediate period after World War II did contribute to the stability of Western Europe and provided space, opportunity for the Western Europeans to recover from World War II and to establish governments, societies that today are relatively liberal, relatively democratic, and relatively stable. That's the projection of American military power accomplishing something that's positive. But of course, that's then. This is now. What does the projection of American military power in the Islamic world accomplish? And there I think the record is almost entirely negative. So I don't think it's an either or. Either we need an army or we don't need one, or we need to be able to project power, or no, we never should. I think it's a matter of making wise choices about when to act and when not to act. And in that region of the world, over the past 30-some years, we have continually made what are, in my judgment, bad choices, producing negative outcomes, and yet the lessons still don't sink in. With the ISIS campaign as an example, let's go have another bite at the apple. Iraq War 3.0 or whatever it is.
Sir? Yes.
In looking for some force in history that will bring about a change to
A
this,
force in history?
some force, whatever it is in history. I grew up in Britain, and we had every 4 years a belief the selection of the next American president will make the decisive change. This was after Eisenhower, it would be Kennedy, after Johnson, it would be after Nixon. And now there is a notion, whereas you talk about we have lost so many allies in
Hillary
Europe.
Clinton. Hillary Clinton's going to fix
Okay,
everything. I guarantee it.
the question is, do you share this notion which is rampant in Europe?
I think it's one of the great puzzles of American politics, and I'm struck by the fact that because Americans look to the next president as the Messiah who's going to fix everything. And this was abundantly clear in 2008. Although it was driven home then when they awarded Obama the Nobel Peace Prize sort of for showing up, that this expectation extended beyond our own borders. And it puzzles the heck out of me about why this persists. It puzzles me because over and over and over again, the expectation produces disappointment, and also because it's so profoundly at odds with democracy, which ought to be rooted, I think, in an unwillingness to look to some great leader to remove the burdens on the rest of us. Obviously, a presidential election is important. Why we even call this the most powerful man in the world puzzles me. Because as soon as the president takes office, he or she, if it turns out to be a she, is almost immediately caught in a web of constraints. And your point, it happens over and over and over again. I cannot explain to you why this expectation doesn't just vanish, but it surely does not.
Hope springs eternal.
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, Kelly.
Andy, you made a spirited appeal for demilitarizing our policy in this region. And I want to press you a little bit just to clarify.
I saw you take
how,
notes when I was talking.
How far, well, 10 theses, that makes it easy. How far you want to go in this. I haven't read Dick's Foreign Affairs piece, but he says pick your battles, so presumably some. But how few do you want to pick? And let me put it this way. In the period that you describe, in the first decade, American policy was powerfully shaped by two invasions, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Given those invasions, what would your military response have been, if any?
Fair enough. Afghanistan and Kuwait, the two cases. Well, my answer to the first one derives from, and maybe this is unfair, and maybe you'll disagree, what we now know about Soviet motives for intervening in Afghanistan. When it occurred, there was some debate within the United States, what are these guys up to? But the camp that won that debate was the camp that said that this was evidence that the Soviets are on the march. They are taking advantage of our weakness. Next stop, Gulf of Hormuz. We now know, I think, that was not the case whatsoever. That they intervened in Afghanistan for what was, from their point of view, defensive purposes. They feared that the rise of Islamism in Afghanistan was going to destabilize the Soviet Empire. It was going to spread into Central Europe. So knowing what we know now, I would say condemn, but frankly, don't do much beyond that. Other case is the invasion of Kuwait, August 1990. And I think that the answer there is we needed to do what George Herbert Walker Bush did. I think that we needed to, because of the reigning perception at the time about our dependence on foreign oil, and also, and I think this was a large part of his perception, at least as I understand it, that in a post-Cold War order, there needs to be some order. We need to identify certain norms that cannot be violated. So a mission to eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, I think, was appropriate. But here we get into the realm, it's not blaming the president, although you might blame Schwarzkopf, into the uncertainties that accompany any use of force. Matter of fact, you probably could argue that the larger the scale you're using force, the greater the uncertainties become. There was clearly an expectation that having thumped the Iraqi army, the forces internal to Iraq were going to dispose of our Saddam problem. And that never happened. Why didn't it happen? Arguably, because Schwarzkopf at the ceasefire negotiations at Safwan, on his own ticket, as I understand it, without instructions, made concessions to his Iraqi interlocutors that facilitated Saddam's effort to crush the Kurdish and Shia uprisings, which he did successfully. Not blaming the president. I think you can. Schwarzkopf at that point was showboating. I read the account of this. When Schwarzkopf was utterly Safwan was where they did where Schwarzkopf met the 3 or 4 Iraqi generals and they sorted out the details. Schwarzkopf was absolutely preoccupied with the arrangement of the furniture because he told his subordinates that he expected that the ceasefire site would become a permanent exhibition in the Smithsonian Institution. That's where his brain was. His brain was, my place in history. And so he did some very stupid things. And it ends up being a lot more complicated story as a result of that miscalculation.
We have time for one more.
But but the other thing is, and I think it's true of George Herbert Walker Bush, he didn't seriously think that democracy is going to suddenly bloom and spread across the region just because we had thumped Saddam. He wanted order.
Last one.
Last question?
I hope it's an easy one.
You alluded to us not being able to understand history under 20th century terminology. Do you have a coherent paradigm in mind for understanding history in the 21st century?
No, but I just left BU, retired from BU, and I was part of getting a large grant from the Mellon Foundation that has created a seminar that I participate in, the purpose of which is to invite some very creative historians to take on that problem. If what I would call the canonical narrative of World War I leads to World War II, leads to the Cold War, leads to the end of history, if that's not the story that we should, that helps us understand our present circumstances, then what is the story? What is the narrative? And that's what this project is attempting to tease out. Whether it will succeed, I don't know. We're in the early stages of sorting through that. Great question. Actually, if I could answer it, I would be famous.
Richard Bates, and especially Andrew Bacevich, thank you very much for an interesting evening.